I'm Chloe, 26, female. I live in a small but cozy apartment in the city, the kind with more books than shelf space and a perpetually curious cat named Pixel. By day, I'm a UX/UI designer, spending my hours making technology more human, friendly for a large, well-established tech firm called Innovatech Solutions. For the past 4 years, it was more than a job. It was where I found my footing, thanks to a man who was the heart and soul of the company. This is the story of how our soulless new boss fired that man, my mentor, just 3 days before his 29-year pension was set to vest, and how a single, carefully placed phone call started a chain reaction that burned his empire to the ground. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Frank Miller was a living legend at Innovatech. At 61, with silver hair and a kind, crinkled smile, he was the company's first ever systems architect. He had written the code for our original flagship product on a computer that now belonged in a museum. His institutional knowledge wasn't just valuable, it was the entire foundation upon which our modern systems were built. When I joined as a fresh-faced graduate, terrified and overwhelmed, Frank was the one who took me under his wing. He didn't just teach me about the company's ancient back-end systems. He taught me about corporate life, about integrity, and about how to navigate the complex maze of personalities. Always document everything, Chloe, he'd say, tapping a stack of printed-out server logs. People forget, but the data never lies. Frank wasn't just a mentor. He was the unofficial office dad to half the junior staff. He remembered birthdays, asked about your family, and always had a stash of the good candy in his desk drawer. He was counting down the days to his retirement, not with sadness, but with a quiet, joyful anticipation. He planned to buy an RV and travel the country with his wife, Mary. His pension, the culmination of nearly 3 decades of loyalty, was the key to that dream. He was 3 days away, just 72 hours, from walking out the door with the security he had earned 10 times over. The atmosphere at Innovatech had been changing for the past year, ever since James Harrison was brought in as the new head of digital transformation. Harrison was the quintessential corporate shark. He was 45, impeccably dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than my rent, and he spoke in a constant stream of buzzwords like synergy, disruption, and paradigm shift. He saw the company not as a collection of people, but as a series of assets and liabilities on a spreadsheet. From his first day, he viewed Frank not as a founder of the company's success, but as an outdated, slow, and expensive relic. He made passive-aggressive comments in meetings about legacy thinking. While staring directly at Frank, he'd praise the younger, cheaper new hires for their agile mindsets, a clear dig at Frank's methodical, careful approach. Frank, ever the professional, took it in stride. He's just trying to make his mark. Frank would tell me over coffee, "Don't worry about it, I'm almost at the finish line," but I saw the toll it took. Harrison would constantly question Frank's timelines, demand unnecessary reports, and exclude him from key meetings about the very systems Frank had built. It was a classic case of a new boss trying to push out the old guard. The final project Frank was overseeing was a massive server migration, a delicate and complex task he had been planning for over a year. It was his final contribution, his legacy project. Harrison, however, seemed determined to undermine it at every turn. He kept insisting Frank was taking too long and that the new blood could do it faster and cheaper. This was his final Titan stand, a last push to hand over his life's work in perfect condition, and Harrison was treating him like a liability that needed to be managed. We all felt the tension, but none of us could have predicted how low Harrison was willing to stoop. The finish line was in sight, and we were all cheering Frank on, completely oblivious to the axe that was about to fall. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the absolute worst time for any corporate execution. The office was winding down, people were chatting about their weekend plans, and a sense of calm had settled over the floor. Frank was at his desk, running final diagnostics for the weekend server migration. He had a small, contented smile on his face. He had his retirement countdown clock on his monitor. It read 3 days. He'd even brought in donuts that morning to celebrate his last big project. I was at my desk, finishing up a wireframe, when I saw Harrison striding towards Frank's cubicle, followed by a woman from HR I didn't recognize. Harrison's face was a mask of cold, corporate indifference. He didn't even have the decency to look apologetic. He just stood there, arms crossed, as the HR representative mumbled something about corporate restructuring and redundancies. Frank's smile vanished. The color drained from his face. I saw him try to speak, to ask a question, but Harrison cut him off. "The decision is final, Frank," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire section of the office to hear. "We're moving in a more dynamic direction. We'll have security escort you out. Please pack your personal belongings." Just like that. 29 years of service, loyalty, and brilliance erased in a 30-second speech. The entire floor went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone stared, horrified. Security guards, looking uncomfortable, appeared and stood by Frank's desk as he slowly, shakily, began to place a few photos of his wife and grandkids into a small cardboard box. He didn't look at anyone. His shoulders were slumped in a way I'd never seen before. He looked defeated, broken. As they walked him towards the elevator, he made eye contact with me for just a second. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was pure, unadulterated shock and humiliation. He had given his entire adult life to this company, and they were treating him like a criminal. He was 3 days away. 3 days, everyone knew what that meant. No pension, the dream of the RV, of traveling with his wife, of a secure and peaceful retirement. All of it gone. Harrison, meanwhile, acted as if nothing had happened. He walked back to his glass-walled office and took a phone call, laughing at something the person on the other end said. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. He had just destroyed a man's life, a man who had built the very foundation Harrison stood upon, and he was laughing. That was the moment something inside me snapped. The sadness and shock turned into a cold, hard rage. I watched Harrison, so smug and untouchable in his office, and I knew I couldn't let this go. Frank wasn't just a colleague, he was my friend. He deserved justice. The rest of the office was in a state of stunned silence. People were whispering, afraid to speak too loudly. They were scared for their own jobs. Who would be next? If they could do this to Frank, a company legend, then no one was safe. But I wasn't just scared, I was furious, and as I watched Frank disappear into the elevator, I made a silent promise to him and to myself. Harrison was going to pay for this. He just didn't know it yet. The weekend was a blur of anger and helplessness. I tried calling Frank, but his phone went straight to voicemail. His wife, Mary, eventually texted me back, saying he was too devastated to speak to anyone. She confirmed my worst fear. The company had informed him that since his employment was terminated before his vesting date, he was entitled to nothing. His pension was gone, all of it. Innovatech had a reputation for being a great place to work, a family company. That reputation was a lie, and James Harrison was the one who had exposed it. When I walked into the office on Monday morning, the atmosphere was toxic. The air was thick with fear and resentment. Frank's desk sat empty, a gaping hole in the middle of our department. His nameplate was already gone. Harrison had called a brief, soulless team meeting first thing. "As you know, Frank Miller is no longer with the company," he announced without a hint of emotion. "We wish him the best in his future endeavors. This change is part of our strategic realignment to foster innovation and agility. I've promoted Chloe Bishop to lead the server migration project, effective immediately." Chloe Bishop was a junior designer, barely 2 years out of college, who spent more time complimenting Harrison's ties than doing her actual job. It was a slap in the face. She had nowhere near the expertise to handle such a critical task. It became instantly clear, this wasn't just about getting rid of Frank, it was about replacing him with someone younger, cheaper, and more compliant. The whispers started almost immediately, in the break room, by the coffee machine, in hushed conversations over Slack. People were outraged, but they were also terrified. Harrison had made his point, loyalty meant nothing. No one was safe. I decided to start my own quiet investigation. My first stop was the server room. It was Frank's domain, a place he treated like a sacred temple. I knew he kept meticulous records of everything, not just on the company servers, but physical records too. He was old school like that. A digital file can be deleted, he'd often said, but a paper trail is much harder to erase. I made an excuse about needing to check some legacy asset files and got access to the room. In the back corner, behind a dusty rack of decommissioned servers, was Frank's old filing cabinet. It was supposed to have been cleared out, but in their haste to erase him, they had overlooked it. I spent my lunch break sifting through old project files, network diagrams, and maintenance logs, and then I found it. It was a thick binder labeled Project Nightingale Phase 1. I had never heard of this project. Inside were printouts of emails, budget proposals, and strategy documents, all from the last 6 months. It was a secret project, spearheaded by Harrison himself. The plan was to outsource our entire server infrastructure and a significant portion of our development team to an overseas contracting firm. The emails detailed the cost savings with a specific line item showing how much the company would save on pension and retirement liabilities for long-term employees. Frank's name was explicitly mentioned in one of the emails from Harrison to the CFO. Harrison wrote, "Terminating Miller pre-vesting will save us a significant payout and set a precedent for future restructuring." It wasn't just a heartless cost-cutting measure, it was premeditated. They had targeted Frank specifically to avoid paying him what he was owed. And the most damning part, the email was dated 3 months ago. They had been planning this for months, all while Frank was working himself to the bone on his final project. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just unethical, it felt criminal. I took out my phone and carefully photographed every single page in that binder. The data never lies, Frank had always said, and this data was telling a very ugly story. Armed with the photos from Frank's secret binder, I knew I had the motive. But motive alone wasn't enough. Harrison was slick. He would deny everything, claim the documents were just exploratory, and paint me as a disgruntled employee. I needed more. I needed to show not just that he planned it, but that he was benefiting from it personally, and that the company was at risk because of his recklessness. My next step was to dig into the company he was planning to outsource everything to. The binder named the firm, Ethelred Digital Services. It sounded vaguely impressive, but a quick search revealed it was a brand, new company with almost no online presence. It had been incorporated only 6 months ago. That was a huge red flag. Why would a company like Innovatech risk its entire infrastructure with a completely unknown, unproven vendor? I spent the next few nights diving deep. As a UX designer, I'm good at finding information and seeing patterns. I started with corporate registration records. Ethelred Digital Services was registered as a limited liability company. The registration documents were public, but the owner was hidden behind another holding company. It was a shell game, but shell companies leave traces. I started cross-referencing names, addresses, and known associates. I used social media, professional networking sites, and public records databases. It took hours of painstaking work, referencing every name associated with the holding company. Finally, I found a connection. The holding company was managed by a law firm, and one of the partners at that firm had a very familiar last name, Harrison. It was James Harrison's brother-in-law. Ethelred Digital Services wasn't just some random overseas firm. It was a company secretly owned by Harrison's family. He wasn't just firing Frank to save the company money on a pension. He was firing him and dozens of future employees to create a budget vacuum that he could then fill by awarding a massive multi-million-dollar contract to himself. He was gutting Innovatech from the inside out and funneling the money directly into his own pocket. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I looked at the new project lead, Chloe Bishop. Harrison had put her in charge of the server migration, a task she was laughably unqualified for. Why, I looked into her work history. She had previously worked at a small startup for a year before joining Innovatech. I searched for the startup's founder. His name was also on the board of the holding company that owned Ethelred. Chloe wasn't just a sycophant, she was part of the plan. She was Harrison's inside person, placed to ensure the migration would fail just enough to justify the emergency, switch to his new, unproven vendor. They weren't just planning to defraud the company, they were actively sabotaging a critical piece of infrastructure to do it. I now had a complete picture, a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led from Frank's termination directly to James Harrison's bank account. He had planned Frank's firing, created a shell company to receive a fraudulent contract, installed an accomplice to sabotage the project, and was about to rob the company blind. I saved all my evidence, the photos from the binder, screenshots of the corporate records, social media connections, and a detailed timeline of events, into a secure, encrypted folder. The data was all there, clear as day. Now, all I needed was a plan to make sure the right people saw it. It was time to make my phone call. I had the evidence, a digital smoking gun pointed directly at Harrison, but I couldn't just walk into the CEO office. Harrison was a master manipulator. He would have a dozen ways to spin this, discredit me, and get me fired before I finished my first sentence. I couldn't go to HR either, because Harrison had his own people there. I needed to get the information to someone who was impartial, who understood corporate governance, and who had the authority to launch a real investigation without tipping off Harrison. I needed someone who followed the rules to the letter. That's when I remembered Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a compliance officer in the HR department, but she operated separately from the generalists. Her job was to ensure the company followed the labor laws, financial regulations, everything. I had worked with her once on a project to ensure our new app design was compliant with accessibility standards. She was sharp, meticulous, and had a reputation for being a total bulldog when it came to corporate policy. She was also a private person who kept her head down and didn't play office politics. She was perfect. I looked up her number in the company directory and called her personal cell phone after work hours. "Sarah, it's Chloe," I said, my voice tense. "I need to talk to you about something, but it has to be off the record and away from the office." There was a pause. Sarah was cautious. "What is this regarding?" she asked, her tone neutral. "It's about Frank Miller's termination," I said, "and Project Nightingale." The mention of the project code name got her attention. Another pause, then, "Meet me at the coffee shop on Elm Street tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. before work." The next morning, in a quiet corner of the coffee shop, I laid everything out. I showed her the photos from the binder, the corporate registration documents for Ethelred, the link to Harrison's brother-in-law, and the connection to Chloe Bishop. I explained how they were setting up the server migration to fail so they could push through the fraudulent contract. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing more and more grim. She didn't interrupt. She just scrolled through the files on my tablet, her eyes missing nothing. When I was finished, she looked up, her face set like stone. "He didn't just break company policy," she said, her voice low and furious. "This is wire fraud, conspiracy. He's using company resources to enrich his family, and targeting a vested pension employee to do it is a major violation of labor laws." She was in, but she agreed that we couldn't go through the normal channels. We needed a plan, a way to expose Harrison to the highest levels of the company and the board of directors all at once, leaving him no room to escape. He's presenting his new departmental strategy at the quarterly all-hands meeting next week, Sarah said, a strategic glint in her eye. "The entire executive team and the board chairman will be there. He'll have a big presentation." A plan began to form in my mind, a digital Trojan horse. Harrison asked me to help Chloe Bishop with the visuals for that presentation. I said, "He wants it to look slick. He's given me access to the presentation file on the shared drive." A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. "Oh, has he now?" she said. The plan was simple yet beautiful. Harrison was going to deliver his own indictment. I would spend the next week helping Chloe create a stunning presentation, full of corporate graphics and buzzwords, but hidden within that presentation, I would embed our evidence. I would create a secret password, protected appendix. During the Q&A session after Harrison's speech, Sarah, sitting in the audience, would ask a very specific, pre-planned question about vendor selection protocols for Project Nightingale. It would be the key. The question would force Harrison to either lie to the board or open the very file that would expose everything. He was about to walk into the biggest meeting of his career, ready to celebrate his triumph. He had no idea he was carrying the bomb that would blow it all up. The day of the quarterly all-hands meeting arrived with a palpable sense of tension in the air. The main auditorium was packed. The CEO, the entire C-suite, and the chairman of the board were all sitting in the front row. James Harrison was on stage, soaking in the spotlight. He was in his element, pacing back and forth with a wireless microphone, oozing confidence. He was wearing an obnoxiously expensive watch and a smug smile. I was sitting in the back, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah was a few rows ahead, looking calm and professional. The presentation file, our Trojan horse, was loaded onto the main screen. Harrison launched into his speech. It was a masterclass in corporate nonsense. He talked about disrupting the ecosystem, leveraging core competencies, and actualizing a new digital reality. He painted a picture of himself as the visionary savior of Innovatech. Then he got to the slide about departmental restructuring. "We've had to make some difficult decisions to streamline our operations for maximum efficiency," he said coolly, clicking to a slide that showed impressive and completely fabricated cost-saving projections. By retiring legacy systems and the personnel associated with them, we've opened up the capital for exciting new partnerships. He didn't mention Frank by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. I felt a surge of pure rage. He finished his presentation to a round of polite applause, and now I'd be happy to take any questions, he said, beaming at the executives in the front row. A few softball questions came from his allies in management. Then, Sarah raised her hand. Harrison pointed to her. Yes, Sarah, from compliance. Sarah stood up, her voice clear and steady, projecting through the entire auditorium. Thank you, James, a very forward-thinking presentation, she began politely. I have a question regarding the new vendor partnership you alluded to for Project Nightingale. Could you elaborate on the due diligence process for selecting Ethelred Digital Services? Given they're a new firm, I'm sure the board would be interested in the rigorous vetting process you undertook. You could see a flicker of panic in Harrison's eyes. He wasn't expecting a question from compliance. Of course, he stammered, recovering quickly. Our process was extremely thorough. We vetted several candidates, and Ethelred provided the most dynamic and cost-effective solution. Excellent, Sarah replied, not missing a beat. Then you wouldn't mind showing us the vetting and compliance appendix in your presentation. I believe it's on slide 24. It should have all the competitive bids and background checks. Harrison froze. His smile faltered. He knew he was trapped. The CEO and the chairman were now looking at him, their expressions curious. He couldn't refuse without looking like he was hiding something. I had named the final slide Appendix Vettin Confidential. He had seen the name but had never bothered to click on it, assuming it was just placeholder work for me and Chloe, of course. He said through a strained smile, turning to the tech assistant, "Pull up slide 24. The slide appeared on the giant screen behind him. It was a simple, clean title, Ethelred Digital Services, Due Diligence. I had designed it to look like any other corporate slide. Harrison clicked the remote to advance to the next slide, and there it was. Not a competitive bid, but a crystal, clear screenshot of his email to the CFO, the one where he explicitly mentioned firing Frank to save on pension costs. The auditorium went dead silent. He frantically clicked again. The next slide was a detailed corporate structure diagram showing Ethelred owned by the holding company, which was owned by his brother-in-law. Click. A screenshot of his family vacation photo from social media with him and his brother-in-law arms around each other. Click. A slide detailing the complete lack of qualifications for Chloe Bishop and her connection to the shell company. With every click, a new piece of evidence appeared on the giant screen for the entire company to see. Harrison stood there, paralyzed, as the architecture of his entire fraudulent scheme was laid bare. His face went from pale to ghostly white. The CEO was on his feet, his face a mask of fury. The chairman of the board was already on his phone, likely calling legal. Harrison dropped the remote, clattered on the stage. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was done. His career, his reputation, everything he had built on lies and cruelty, was incinerated in front of hundreds of people by his own hand. It was a beautiful, glorious, and utterly silent ambush. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. James Harrison was fired on the spot, escorted out of the building by the same security team that had walked Frank out just a week earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone. Chloe Bishop was fired the next morning. The company immediately launched a full-scale internal and external investigation. The board of directors issued a public apology, and the CEO himself called Frank Miller. 2 days later, Frank walked back into the office, not as an employee, but as an honored guest. The CEO met him at the door, shook his hand, and apologized to him in front of the entire department. He announced that Frank's termination was being officially rescinded. He was being given a choice. He could be reinstated with back pay, or he could accept his immediate, fully vested retirement effective that day. On top of his full pension, the company offered him a substantial settlement package for wrongful termination and emotional distress. Frank, with a grace and dignity that Harrison could never comprehend, calmly accepted the retirement package. He gave a short, emotional speech, thanking everyone for their support. He looked at me across the room and gave me a small, knowing nod. That was all the thanks I needed. The changes at Innovatech were profound. The story of Harrison's public implosion became a corporate legend, a cautionary tale about greed and arrogance. The board mandated a complete overhaul of HR and management practices, with Sarah Jenkins appointed to lead the new Ethics and Compliance Task Force. The culture of fear that Harrison had created evaporated overnight, replaced by a renewed sense of community and respect. My role in the whole affair remained mostly behind the scenes, just as I wanted. Sarah kept my confidence, but a few key people knew what I had done. I was quietly promoted to a lead designer position, given my own team, and a significant raise. A few weeks later, I received a postcard in the mail. It was a picture of a gleaming new RV parked in front of the Grand Canyon. On the back, it read, "Chloe, words can't express our gratitude. The open road is even better than I dreamed. First stop is this big ditch. Next, who knows? Thank you for everything, Frank and Mary." I stuck the postcard on the wall above my desk. James Harrison's old office, the one with the big glass walls, sat empty for months. No one wanted it. It was a reminder of how quickly a throne built on deceit can crumble. Eventually, they converted it into a collaborative workspace for junior developers. Every time I walk by, I see a group of young, enthusiastic people working together, and I smile. Frank got his dream, Harrison got what he deserved, and Innovate, tech was forced to become a better place. And it all happened because they underestimated the quiet girl in the design department and the loyalty she had for the man who taught her that the data never lies. It turns out he was right.